These mums are in these tiny crates, which are basically the length and width of a pig. They can't move, they can't turn around. So there's these mums lying there with the bars pressing in against them on both sides, and their babies around them running from one side to the other.
The news release from Associate Agriculture Minister Andrew Hoggard was headlined, "Animal welfare requirements for pig farming to be strengthened."
A ban on farrowing crates and mating pens was set to begin in December, but the government has stepped in to make what it says are pragmatic changes that significantly strengthen animal welfare.
The Animal Welfare Minister, Andrew Hoggard, says new regulations allowing the use of larger crates with a decade-long transition period gives farmers the time they need to prepare.
Where we've landed is what I felt was quite a good middle ground that was reasonably well supported by a lot of science.
Who could be outraged by that? Well, as it turns out, a lot of people, because the changes are not what they appeared to be on the label.
Well, number one, those requirements don't kick in until 2035, 10 years from now. And number two, and most importantly, I can't sort of emphasise this enough, they were going to become illegal in December. They weren't allowed to be used at all in December. And so it's pretty cheeky, I'd say, at the very least, of government to sort of claim this as a welfare win for pigs.
That's Marcelo Rodrigues Ferrer, an associate professor at Auckland University's Faculty of Law and also the president of the Animal Law Association. His research focuses on the legal regulation of animal law, including minimum standards of animals in our agricultural system. He's not alone in slamming the proposed changes.
Opponents say it's a step backwards.
10 more years of misery for mother pigs and piglets. 10 more years.
You know, we're making decisions now for in 10 years' time that in a sense are still archaic because we're still going to be confining mother pigs in one way or another. Farrowing crates should have gone out the door when sow stalls were banned.
I'm Alexia Russell, and today on The Detail, animal welfare changes that do the opposite of banning controversial farrowing crates and mating stalls that are so contrary to the current Animal Welfare Act that the government will have to change the law to get them through.
A court finding in 2020 ruled that allowing the crate's use breached the Animal Welfare Act's requirement to meet animals' physical, health and behavioural needs.
Marcelo says this move should outrage not just those who care about animal welfare, but anyone who cares about democracy. He says the legal manoeuvring around the law has been done
in the weirdest way that I have ever seen.
It sets out that the regulations previously ruled unlawful are and always have been valid.
One way that the government likes to describe it is that they won an election in 2023, and then that means that they have a legislative majority and they can do whatever they want. And that's a very thin, cynical way of thinking about a democratic mandate.
Before we get into that, some history is required. To help me out is RNZ rural reporter Monique Steele, who's been covering this issue.
Once the Animal Welfare Act was established in 1999, there were codes of animal welfare as well that farmers would have to sort of adhere to, with regulations around animal husbandry and all the way through the production process. And there was some public pressure kind of building on those aspects of the farrowing crates, which is where the birthing of the pigs happens there, and then the mating stalls as well. There's been some opposition, obviously, there from the likes of SAFE, animal rights groups, and SPCA.
In 2018, 112,000 people signed a petition against the use of farrowing crates. In 2020, a huge victory for animal welfare groups.
The High Court has ruled the use of farrowing crates for pigs unlawful and wants changes to the legislation. SAFE and New Zealand Animal Law Association took the matter to court in June, citing animal welfare concerns. In its decision out today, the court says the Agriculture Minister must consider new regulations phasing out their use, along with mating stalls.
At the time, the pork industry felt that they weren't being properly consulted on these issues because they were really worried about the cost of these adaptations. So there was a fair amount of pushback back then even that it would be an expensive adjustment for farmers to their farming systems. So they mean that in the sense of the crates would have to be changed.
The then Labour government gave the sector 5 years to make those changes, but it didn't stay in power long enough to cement the changes in law. 2 weeks ago, Andrew Hoggard acted, prompting Labour's animal welfare spokesperson Rachel Boyack to protest.
Really concerning that the draft code of welfare for pigs has been sitting there ready for implementation following consultation where 40,000 submissions were heard back in 2022. And instead of putting that code of welfare in place, the Minister has weakened the standards and is pushing it out another 10 years.
Economic viability was obviously a big concern for NZ Pork, who represents pig farmers. They felt that it would cost hundreds of thousands of dollars for each farm to change their operation to meet new rules. But by the time, like Minister Hoggard told me that the sector as of October, didn't really know what was expected of them. So there was this deadline looming, but he argues that they didn't actually know. He says the pork industry didn't know how to even meet these rules. It was like they argue that it's quite vague. And it comes back down to the different types of farming systems as well. So like for our pig farming sector, there's more than half of the pigs there are indoor farmed. And so that's obviously entirely sheltered. And then the other sector is the free farmed pigs, which is sort of 40% of the pigs there. And that means they've just got a wee bit more freedom there, that they're bred inside of those huts. They can kind of access open fields and things. And piglets are born and sort of raised in the same environment with the adults until weaning. And then free range is what a lot of people go straight to when we sort of talk about these animal welfare clauses. But, free range is only 3% of the pig, sort of farmed pig population. And that would, in a free range scenario, that's where they live in those huts. You tend to see them around my home of South Canterbury. That's where you see a lot of the huts on the side of State Highway 1.
Free range, obviously the sows are outside all the time, and if you look at these, this is our farrowing paddock, so each sow's got their own individual hut that they'll have their litter in, and the piglets have got the ability to run around outside once they decide to come outside the hut, and they tend to go just wherever they like. They get in little gangs and they might run away across the other side of the paddock, and they'll see you coming and they'll all run back to mum, and they all know which hut to go to. It's amazing.
But yeah, with those free range, so the piglets are a lot more involved with mum, and in the indoor it's a little different. The argument for the crates is that they actually protect both the piglets and the mum, because pigs are very sentient type beings, and they're very intelligent and socio-intelligent as well. So when there is stress, they do respond to stress. So there's a bit of a push and pull there, because with the crates, they do believe that it reduces the risk of mama pig sort of rolling onto the piglets. But again, the likes of animal welfare groups sort of argue that the crates create stress. So I think that's possibly why the government sort of made some proposals there about the restrictions on the time, the duration in those crates.
Andrew Hoggard explains those proposed changes.
Three main regulations were moving the time allowed in a farrowing crate down from 33 days down to 7 days. So 3 days pre-farrowing and 4 days post-farrowing. And we're increasing the space requirements for weaner and growing pigs by 13.3%, and also reducing the time that a pig is allowed to be in a mating stall down from 7 days to 3 hours at any one time. The science said they just did not need to be in there that long. You shouldn't need to leave them in there for 7 days.
The pork industry says it recognises the government has had a difficult job balancing science, practicalities and costs, but at least this move gives certainty. This is the chief executive of NZ Pork, Brent Kleiss, from an interview he did with Monique after the plans were announced.
Now, without knowing what it was that farmers are expected to transition to, There's been many that have held off investment in making those changes, and some that have actually left the industry too, just because the waiting got too long and the uncertainty got too much. And what this announcement does, is it finally gives them that certainty. So they're happy to have that. There's still definitely considerable on-farm investment and changes that are going to have to happen, hence that long time period in order to do it. There's significant change. So the 10-year time period is appropriate in order for farmers to be able to make, depending on the size of their farm, sometimes $1 million changes to their investment.
Brent Kleiss says for some farmers it could take 19 years to repay investment of some of these changes. But let's get back to Marcelo Rodriguez Ferrer on legal manipulations and farrowing crates.
The pigs can't move around, and I don't know if you can try to sort of imagine it. It's really quite difficult actually to imagine how cruel that must be to not be able to turn around. But presently for days on end, mother sows are prevented from moving around. And that would normally be a breach of the Animal Welfare Act. We have some sort of general standards that apply to anyone who is in control or in charge of an animal or owns an animal. And one of those obligations is to provide for the opportunity to exhibit natural behaviour. And obviously, part of natural behaviour of pigs is the capacity to turn around. And so normally that would be a breach of the Act. But for a long time, we've had regulations that sort of permit that. The New Zealand Animal Law Association and SAFE led a challenge against those regulations in 2020, and they were successful in the High Court in challenging those regulations. The effect of that High Court ruling was that the government was required to phase the use of those devices out. Well, it's very complicated to go back to those sorts of decisions that were sort of taken now about a decade ago. But the way to sort of understand this is that the law started to change, and we sort of recognized that a lot of practices within commercial operations were cruel. And the government actually in 2015 said, look, with those sorts of regulations and those sorts of standards, we're going to sort of ensure that that they're going to be phased out. And so the case basically held that the regulations that permitted them were unlawful, and that forced the government in 2020 to institute new regulations that permitted these, but said that they're only around for the next 5 years. And so on the 18th of December 2025, these devices were due to be phased out completely. The use of them would be unlawful, completely illegal, because, as I've said, they just simply don't meet the standards within the Animal Welfare Act. And what the government did was introduce legislation to essentially allow those farrowing crates and mating stalls to be permitted indefinitely.
I acknowledge that these proposals will not be welcomed by all those with an interest in animal welfare. The proposed changes in this bill significantly strengthen animal welfare, are pragmatic, reflect available technologies, and have been informed by expert advice on the current science and good practice.
SAFE have been very vocal about their opposition to the use of both farrowing crates and mating stalls. And I think because it sounded as if New Zealand was going to abandon the use altogether in those sort of years prior, SAFE's chief executive, Deborah Ashton, she said to me that she was shocked at the change because they felt that it had undone sort of decades of animal welfare progress. Because this government too, SAFE were pretty vocal on the incoming coalition had promised to reinstate the trade of live animal exports by sea as well. So that's another animal welfare issue there that's drawn a fair amount of backlash there from sector groups as well.
My other hat is a public lawyer, and I look at sort of lots of things, including sort of legislative design as well as sort of the use of sort of executive power. Because I've sort of mentioned, and I understand sort of how complicated this is, but the government were allowed to sort of put these regulations in as long as they could sort of be phased out. So the High Court held that these mating stalls and farrowing crates, they are illegal unless you put regulations in that would sort of phase out their use. And says, as I say, that the government did that in 2020. There was a 5-year phase-out period that was going to end in December of this year. Now, the government could only do that once. They could only sort of institute one phase-out period, kind of renewable phase-out periods. They couldn't extend that period without difficulty. And so the only way of permitting these farrowing crates and mating stalls to continue was to basically say that the law doesn't apply to these particular regulations and these particular practices. And that's what they've done in this bill. They've literally said that, these regulations don't comply with the law. The farrowing crates and mating stalls, basically they accept that they don't meet the standards of the Act, but they carve them out from the rest of the Act as being permitted. Now, that's super weird because the whole point of the Act providing for a clear process for sort of regulations to be made was to ensure that cruel practices like farrowing crates and mating stalls weren't going to be used on an ongoing basis. And any use of those sorts of cruel devices would be subject to a phase-out period. But essentially, the government and using the majority in Parliament has said, we just don't really want to do that anymore, so they're carving them out. And so that means that these regulations sit outside of the Act and the usual requirements that we would have for sort of cruel practices such as these, making a bit of a dog's breakfast of the Animal Welfare Act and the associated regulations, but also sort of undermining the original intent of Parliament in 2015 when it set up these sorts of particular regulations and the way that they would be controlled. As I say, it's very, very weird, and I've never sort of seen this approach before.
So they didn't have to declare that pigs weren't animals or anything like that?
Honestly, I wouldn't be surprised at this point that they would start as sort of just those sorts of weird things. It really is sort of very odd. And although Parliament can do this, there is definitely the legal power to do this. But the real problem with this is that this tends to sort of countermand exactly what the government had planned to do 5 years ago by phasing them out, and the extensive consultation procedures that followed. And so by basically going against all of the public submissions that occurred in 2022, as well as the independent advice that government received in 2022, it's a real betrayal of that consultation process. The only body that seems to agree with the current regulations that are proposed and the actions by government happen to be the pork industry, who provided for a proposal that looks uncannily similar to what the government is now proposing. And so it just feels a bit odd, a bit off at best, and sort of really shows a worrying level of regulatory capture at worst.
The science and the research and the submissions, from our point of view, really, really supported maybe a position that the previous government wasn't willing to take.
A leading animal welfare group says it's been blindsided by the government quietly walking back a ban on pig crates weeks before it was due to come into force.
If you say that you consulted with everybody and the SPCA, who happen to know one or two things about sort of animal welfare, this is a body that enforces the Animal Welfare Act. They're not a lobby group. They aren't sort of a special interest group. They have a really important role under the Animal Welfare Act and enforcing it alongside the Ministry for Primary Industries and the police. They are integral to our animal welfare system. And they say they have been blindsided by this move. They were not consulted despite wanting to sort of be part of the consultation. Other groups, including the New Zealand Animal Law Association, SAFE, and other sort of groups have also not been sort of consulted over this. So it actually is pretty offensive, I would say, for the minister to say that he has consulted with appropriate groups. There was a consultation period and process, but that was 3 years ago, and that was on a completely different set of principles. And so to say that he has consulted with everybody really is just not concordant with the truth, if I'm going to say, as far as I will say on that.
I know this is a very pro-business government and pro-farmers. What stock do you put in the explanation that the new laws would have disadvantaged our pork farmers?
Yeah, well, number one, not all pork farmers use these devices. Only about half of pork farmers do. And so I don't sort of buy even to sort of like the underlying premise that this would necessarily sort of put them at a sort of commercial disadvantage. The second point I would say to that, though, is that if this would sort of disadvantage New Zealand pork farmers, because for some reason they say that, abroad, farmers are allowed to do this, and therefore putting higher welfare standards for pigs in New Zealand puts them at a disadvantage, I'd say there were ways of fixing that. And I just happen to be the named petitioner on a petition currently before Parliament that would see imports of animal products that don't meet New Zealand's animal welfare standards to be banned. And that's the way that we wouldn't necessarily participate in a race to the bottom here. New Zealand should be able to be proud of its animal welfare standards and high standards at that. And the way to sort of compete amongst the world isn't to sort of race to the bottom and have the lowest standards that we possibly can have. And so to ensure sort of the cheapest possible pork at the lowest quality welfare for pigs. The way to achieve sort of competitive advantage is to celebrate our high standards, protect our pork industry and the high animal welfare standards that would be there, but we do it through that sort of protection of those standards in that industry, not allowing them to sort of abandon all animal welfare concerns. I mean, it's really important that we take care of the animals in our charge, not just because of their interests, but they are significant and that should be our focus, but because it's just the right thing to do. And to say that essentially we're putting them at a commercial disadvantage because we're requiring them to sort of meet fairly sort of minimum standards of, I repeat again, a pig being able to turn around, I think is the least that we can do in this situation.
Now, if you, as a bacon, ham and pork consumer, want to avoid pig meat produced on farms with farrowing crates, good luck. 3/4 of our pork products are imported, and not all of those countries have strict animal welfare requirements. Farrowing crates and mating stalls have been banned entirely in Switzerland, Finland and Norway, along with parts of the EU. But they're permitted in Canada and the United States, as well as China, India and Brazil.
Consumers have sort of limited options in a way in terms of how they can vote with their wallet, because the SPCA, you might have seen in the supermarkets, they have a sort of SPCA certification sticker, little tick, a stamp on some food, and that shows when these producers have met or surpassed the best practice animal welfare that they believe. And I looked online this morning and there's no products there for pork.
I think New Zealanders don't know a lot about how our food is produced and how our agricultural system works. And they trust that, and with good reason, they trust that our production methods are meeting the highest animal welfare standards and are evidence and science-led. And so when these sorts of devices are revealed, I think most New Zealanders are pretty shocked that that's the way that we allow for some pigs to be raised in New Zealand.
These law changes are going through the select committee process now, and the SPCA is urging New Zealanders to speak up on farrowing crates. There are just 8 days left to do that. That's it for today. The Detail is a newsroom production supported by RNZ and New Zealand On Air. This episode was engineered by Mark Chesterman and produced by Gwen McClure. Thanks to Monique Steele and Marcelo Rodriguez Ferrer. I'm Alexia Russell. Ka kite anō.